Before we begin, if you enjoy gentle bedtime tales like this, don't forget to subscribe so you'll always have a story for you when the night grows quiet. Chapter 1, A Kingdom of Envy and Beauty. Once in a valley cupped by blue mountains and braided rivers, there stood a kingdom of glass-bright mornings and candle-soft nights. It was a place where bells rang sweetly at noon, where swallows stitched the sky with silver thread, and where a grand castle watched over orchards like a lighthouse of stone. The people lived their days with simple hopes: warm bread, safe children, a roof that kept the rain. But every evening their whispers floated up to the palace windows. They spoke of a princess with eyes like morning and a heart that stayed gentle even when the world turned hard. Her name was Snow White. Her mother had once told her that the heavens had kissed her cradle with frost and light. The story went like this. A winter afternoon, a queen at an open window, sewing by the ledge as slow flakes drifted down the way thoughts drift when the body is still. A prick of the needle, a bead of red on skin, and a wish whispered into the cold. A child as fair as snow, lips like the ruby drop, hair as dark as winter branches. Wishes are not promises, but sometimes the sky listens. Snow White arrived, small as a curled hand, soft as a breath, and the kingdom felt new. Time gathered itself into years. Snow White learned to walk where tapestries hung like forests and corridors echoed with music. She learned to step quietly because palaces prefer quiet. She learned to laugh softly because echoes carry far. She learned that kindness can be a language, and she tried to speak it well. She gave crusts to the pigeons that landed on the parapet. She tucked tiny flowers into the guards' belts when they looked cold. She carried her own basket in the kitchens and thanked the scullery boy as if he were a knight returning from war. It is easy to love a person who makes the world around them gentler. Such people make even stone feel warm. But there was another heart in the palace. The queen, now the stepmother queen, wore beauty like armor and pride like perfume. She moved the way a flame moves in a draft, elegant, quick, always needing more air. She kept a room no one else entered, a room that smelled of violet and old smoke, where purple curtains never stirred, and a standing mirror waited, like an eye that never closed. She believed that life was a contest, and that contests must be won. She believed that love is not given freely, but purchased with perfection. She believed that fear keeps order better than trust. A person becomes what they practice, and she practiced envy. When she walked, courtiers lowered their eyes. When she spoke, they nodded as though the air itself had agreed. She had learned to make servants invisible and silence obedient. Yet there was one thing she could not control: the mirror that told the truth. It spoke without favor or fear. It spoke without being asked to flatter. Who is the fairest? The queen would ask when night fell and the palace quieted into the hush of sleeping fires. You are, the mirror would answer, voice smooth as still water. The queen would smile and it was a terrible thing, the kind of smile that eats itself when it is not fed. Snow White did not know all this. She knew only that the queen's gaze felt like winter sometimes, like standing in a hallway where windows leak cold. She learned to make herself smaller in those moments, to turn her face toward open doors and sunlight. She helped in the herb garden because the healers laughed easily there and because Rosemary does not care about politics. She polished the bronze bowl in the chapel because when you look into a bowl of water, your reflection wobbles. It never looks like a contest. She sang because song is a kind of prayer that even walls can hear, and some walls are kinder after prayers. The king, Snow White's father, had the absent kindness of a man who believes that duty is love enough. He rode out, often to patrol borders that rarely changed, and to sign treaties that were already written. When he was home, he looked at his daughter with a warmth that knew it arrived late. He trusted the queen because she never gave him a reason not to, and because trust is easier than questioning for a man who is tired and busy. Sometimes love is not absent. It is simply distracted. That, too, can be a kind of loneliness. So the castle divided itself into weather. Where Snow White walked, you found spring, smiles, clean air, little surprises left on windowsills. Where the queen passed, winter gathered, hushed straight backs, the careful folding of hands. The two seasons met each morning when they crossed the great hall, and each pretended to be polite. The people in the town noticed what palaces forget: that goodness changes the way soup tastes, that a wave from a balcony can warm a baker's small kitchen, that children play braver games when they see gentleness on the throne. They began to leave little gifts on the road that led to the palace: braids of wheat, bundles of lavender, a wooden bird carved by a father who could not afford more and did not need to. Snow White kept a box beside her bed where she saved every token. "One day I will return these," she told herself. "One day I will repay kindness with kindness." She believed promises even when she whispered them alone. She believed in circles that close. The queen heard the rumors, the ones that ride on wind and slip beneath doors, and she went to her mirror sooner each evening, as if truth could be bound tighter by asking it faster. The mirror, faithful and cruel in equal measure, told her what she wanted to hear. And yet, envy is not a thirst that dies when you drink. It grows because it remembers how good water felt, and now it wants rivers. In the garden, Snow White knelt to tie a child's shoe as the child's mother curtsied so low, her hair touched gravel. Snow White lifted the woman with a soft hand. "No, no," she said. "We stand together." She meant the words the way you mean a lantern in a storm. The gardener watched and smiled into his vines. The head cook watched and changed the menu. More apples tonight, more honey. The guard on the east gate watched and felt something soften in the place where fear usually lives. It takes time to change a kingdom. It also takes a single sentence said kindly. In the queen's room, there were no windows. A mirror does not need light to tell the truth. "Who is the fairest?" she asked again. And again the mirror gave her the answer she craved. She slept well then, dreaming of empty halls and people who bowed with their eyes shut. There is a way the world prepares for a story. Small things align, threads pull toward one another, and most people do not notice. But if you sit very still, you can feel the pattern begin. That is what happened in the castle where Snow White grew. The pattern drew tight, the knots hummed, and the mirror waited for a question that would finally change its reply. On a late summer afternoon, Snow White wandered to the orchard where apples hung like lanterns in green shade. She bitten into one, crisp, sweet, the taste of sunlight, and closed her eyes. "I wish," she said, "that everyone could feel safe." It is not the kind of wish that makes a story easy. It is the kind of wish that makes a story true. The orchard held its breath. A breeze carried the red sugar scent toward the palace, up a narrow stair, beneath a thick door, to a room with no windows, where a woman sat very still in front of a mirror. Night fell. The bell in the chapel sighed 10 times. The queen stood. "Well," she said to the mirror, "let us put the world in its proper order." Outside, the stars opened their eyes. Chapter 2. The fairest of them all. The ritual of envy begins gently. A lamp lit, a curtain drawn, the scrape of a chair on stone, and then the question, always the question. "Mirror, mirror on the wall, Who is the fairest of them all? The mirror's surface shimmered as if a pebble had been tossed into a silver lake. Long ago, the glass had been forged in a furnace fed by juniper wood and whispered names. Long ago, the mirror had learned how to hold a voice. Tonight it spoke again, smooth as before, ready to soothe. You are my queen. But truth gathers weight like snow on cedar boughs. The mirror paused as if listening to something far away. A song in an orchard, a laugh in a kitchen, a small act of kindness that landed and did not hurt. The mirror shifted, as if its reflection had a different face beneath it. You are. The surface tightened like frost. No, the mirror said, and the word rang like a tiny bell you only hear when the room is very quiet. You are fair, my queen, but there is one more fair. Air thinned, time thinned. The queen did not draw breath. You would not either if a ceiling suddenly lowered toward your head. Who? The word cracked. Who dares? Snow White, said the mirror. The princess born of winter and wish. She is fairer than you. There are answers you can walk around, and there are answers that pin your feet to the floor. The queen stood pin-fast. Her fingers curled against the silk of her gown until each nail left a crescent moon. She smiled. People seldom notice what a smile can hide. Oh, she said. Is that so? The smile held. Tell me, she whispered. And the whisper bent darkness. Tell me why. The mirror does not explain. Truth does not perform tricks. It had answered all it could. Now it settled back into its own stillness and became again a flat field where a person might lose their face. The queen lifted her head. It felt heavier than bone. She walked from the mirror as if walking through rain, as if each step pushed her body past something invisible that pressed back. She opened her door to a corridor that smelled of polished wood and familiar obedience. Somewhere a dog barked in its sleep. Somewhere a maid leaned against a wall and closed her eyes for just a moment longer before work called her name again. The queen moved past these small human sounds as a storm cloud moves over laundry hung in a yard. Before envy hardens, it aches. It aches like teeth learning a cold fruit. The queen felt that ache run along her ribs, under her collarbone, into the soft place behind her throat. She walked to the balcony and looked down at the town, so quiet now, so trusting. And her ache became shape. She pictured Snow White grown as she had grown, soft steps becoming graceful steps, shy smiles becoming light. She pictured courtiers forgetting to bow to her because they turned to look at the girl. She pictured the king, tired as he was, finding time to watch someone else. Envy fed on pictures. It ate futures as easily as it ate present joy. In the morning, the queen dressed for mercy like a hunter dresses for dawn, carefully. She chose a gown the color of old wine and a veil that suggested humility. She walked to the chapel. She knelt. People who saw her knelt too. It is difficult not to kneel when a crown kneels. She prayed, and her prayer sounded so like goodness that even the chapel birds tilted their heads as if the sound were a sweet crumb to carry to their nests. Snow White entered the chapel quietly and slid into a pew near the back. She bowed her head with the honest ease of a person whose bow means only thank you. The queen did not turn, but it is possible to see without turning if you have practiced it long enough. She felt the room warm. She felt the air loosen around the girl, the way it loosens around a candle that has just been lit. She finished her prayer, a beautiful prayer about peace, and rose. There are ceremonies that become weapons when held by the wrong hands. Envy sharpens even tenderness. Later in the gardens, the queen let her veil slip as if by accident, and Snow White hurried to catch it before it touched the grass. "Thank you," the queen said, turning. The two faces were close then, winter and spring as neighbors, each so certain of its own weather. Snow White smiled. "It's nothing," she said. "Nothing is sometimes the kindest thing," the queen replied, and no one but the sun noticed that her hand trembled. That night, the mirror did not wait. "She is still fair," it said when the queen entered. "The child who thanks kitchen boys and gathers notes others drop. She is the fairest. You may break all your furniture, and the truth will not change its shape." The queen did not break her furniture. She broke her breath into pieces so small she could swallow them without making a sound. Then she called for the captain of the guard. He arrived quickly, boots shining, heart careful. She sent him away more quickly, because he was useful for many things, but not for what she planned. She needed someone who could stand inside a forest and hear what it says. Palaces breed many talent. Woods require another. She sent for the huntsman. He came at dusk, smelling of pine and road, with hands scarred by rope and thorns. He kept his eyes on a point 3 inches beneath the queen's chin, which is where wise men look when they speak to power. "Majesty," he said. "I have a task," she began, "and there are sentences that carry the weight of other sentences that will follow them." The huntsman's shoulders settled, as if a bird had landed there without asking. "You will take the Princess Snow White to the forest. You will lead her to a place where trees have forgotten to be friendly and birds do not sing. You will end her there." She paused. She did not want to say the next words, but her desire not to seem small compared to her need. "You will bring me proof." She looked down at the red apple on the tray beside her, as if it had advice. "Her heart," she said finally, and the word fell between them, with a wet sound only the huntsman could hear. He had expected 3 varieties of painful duty in his life: war, hunger, and the guilt that comes from choosing between them. He had not expected this. But a man lives by the coin he brings home. A man is measured by his obedience more than by his sleep. He bowed. "Do not fail me," said the queen, and the mirror listened without comment. That night, Snow White dreamed of a path under birches and the delicate smell of their paper bark. She dreamed a bird perched on her shoulder and sang a song she did not know and yet had always known. She dreamed a man walking beside her who never looked up. When she woke, a thin thread of fear lay on her pillow. She tied it, like a ribbon, into her hair, because it seemed wrong to throw fear away. Fear, too, teaches us to be careful. Morning came with pale sun and cool water in the basins. Servants rustled like pages turned in a kind book. A knock at her door, respectful. The huntsman bowed low. "Your Highness," he said, "will you walk in the forest today? The blackberry brambles are heavy, and the deer have left their prints like invitations." Snow White glanced at the window where a berry-red bird had landed. It tilted its head as if to say, "Yes, go." The small ribbon of fear tugged once, then fell quiet. "I would like that," she said. In the queen's windowless room, the mirror sat in its usual stillness. It might have trembled if glass could tremble at the thought of what was coming. But truth cannot reach into a person's pocket to break the knife there. It can only speak, and it had spoken. Chapter 3. Shadows in the Castle. Castles do not sleep as people do. They slow, they hum, they keep watch. The great stones remember every step that crossed them, every command that lifted over them, every hush that fell like a shawl. On the morning the huntsman led Snow White toward the trees, the castle felt more awake than usual, like a beast who has turned its head to listen. The corridors kept their own counsel. The tapestries pulled their threads tight. Snow White walked through the eastern arcade with a small basket on her arm. The baker had sent a heel of honeyed bread. The dairyman had left a pat of butter wrapped in a leaf. For good luck, he had said with a wink that tried not to be worried. She had tucked in a cloth and a narrow flask of water. She had added 3 berries, because they were too beautiful not to bring, and beauty wants to be shared. The huntsman paced beside her, knife at hip, silence at the ready. He had known the forest as a boy when it was more story than map. He had learned it as a man, the way you learn pain, by counting what it takes and how long it stays. He had never before led a lamb into a cold part of the field. He had never been asked to be the winter that falls from a clear sky. A crow flew low, an ink stroke above their heads, and cawed like a hinge in need of oil. They passed through the orchard where apples hung bright as thoughts you mean to speak. "Will you have one?" Snow White asked him, lifting a red globe from a low branch. "No," he said a little too quickly, and she nodded as if that were a perfectly ordinary answer. She bit and smiled and wiped the juice with the back of her hand. She looked young then, younger than her years, young enough that the forest might be a game and every path a polite invitation. The huntsman did not look at her. He watched the shade grow thicker in front of them. He listened to the way the leaves talked when the wind pressed them. Go back, go back, go back. In the kitchen, the head cook stirred a pot without seeing it. "She's gone to the woods," he said to no one. The scullery boy glanced at the door as if he could fetch someone from a thought. The baker's girl twisted her apron and prayed to the oven god, who was just a brick with a chip shaped like a smile. In the guardroom, a man buckled his belt tighter than it needed to be. The castle kept humming. When many people worry at once, walls hear. Snow White stepped under the first arch of trees, and the light changed. It softened and deepened, as if the morning had been folded until it was the right size to carry in your hands. The path narrowed. Ferns brushed her skirt with their delicate green hands. A thrush sang 2 notes, and then, embarrassed, stopped. "It's beautiful," she said, and she meant it. "It is," the huntsman said, and he meant it, and neither meaning touched the other. They walked and walked, and the castle fell behind them like a story someone else had told. The forest learned their steps and adjusted to them. It lifted its scent, wet soil and pine sap and the faint sweetness of decay, which is not a bad smell when you understand it. It is the smell of things becoming soil so other things can grow. Snow White breathed it in and felt braver. She loosened the ribbon in her braid and retied it more simply. The huntsman took them through a stand of old oaks whose bark was as ridged as the backs of very patient creatures. He stopped at last in a hollow where the ground sloped slightly and the sky disappeared into leaves. This was the place he had chosen because kindness had to be kept away from paths others used. "We should rest," he said. His voice sounded like it belonged to a different man who had never learned to smile. Snow White sat on a fallen log and set her basket beside her. She offered him water. He drank because you cannot refuse water from someone you are meant to harm. The refusal would be unkind, and contradiction hurts. "Thank you," he said. She broke the bread and handed him half. He held it and did not eat. "Is something wrong?" she asked. The forest stilled to hear. The huntsman looked down into the small brown country of crust and crumb. He had been taught to look at his hands when they shook so that he would know who he was, a man who could do difficult things. But today, when he looked, he saw the hands of a man who could not explain himself to a child. He knelt without deciding to. He knelt because his legs chose for him. "Princess," he said, and it is a terrible thing when a grown man's voice breaks in front of a girl. "Forgive me." He set the bread aside on the moss as if it, too, were a witness that deserved respect. "The Queen sent me to—" He could not finish. He did not own the words that would end the sentence. Snow White did not gasp. She did not scream. She was quiet in a way that made the forest listen for what would come next. She looked into his face as if she could climb it like a hill and stand on the top to see what lived beyond it. "To hurt me?" she said gently. The huntsman pressed his hands together until his knuckles were the color of milk. "Yes," he said. "To end you, to bring proof." He swallowed, and the swallow scraped. "Your heart." The word thudded between them, and even the moss flinched. She nodded slowly, the way you nod when someone explains the rules of a game you never wanted to play. She touched the ribbon in her hair, and then let her hands fall to her lap. "Are you going to do it?" she asked, and her voice held a curious thing. Not accusation, not pleading, only truths. Truth can be very soft and still fill a room. "No," he said, and the word went up like a small, bright bird startled into flight. "No," he said again, because sometimes you must say a word twice to make it real. "Run," he whispered. "Run and do not look back. Find a place where the forest is a church and the air is your friend. Find people who do not own mirrors." He stood, and his legs remembered how. He pulled his knife and hurled it into the earth so that it stood quivering, telling the ground a story of how close it had come. "Go." She rose. She lifted her basket and set it down again because it would slow her more than it would help her. She took one step, and then she turned back. She reached out and touched the huntsman's sleeve. It was a small touch, but it felt like forgiveness wrapped in skin. "Thank you," she said, and left. The forest accepted her the way the water accepts a leaf. It folded around her, then carried her where it would. She ran until her breath held knots, and her feet learned how to find ground they could not see. She ran until fear became a companion rather than an enemy. She ran, and the light under the trees turned to evening light without asking the sun. When she could run no more, she walked. When walking felt like running wearing a disguise, she knelt. She pressed her palms to the earth and told it her name. "Snow White," she whispered to soil and roots and small lives. "Please." She did not know what she asked for, but the forest did. It lifted a moth and laid it on her skirt as if to say, "This is how light bodies rest." Back at the castle, the queen waited without moving. Waiting is a skill in palaces. It uses fewer muscles than mercy. She stood in her windowless room with the mirror and said nothing. When 1 hour had passed, she said nothing. When 2 passed, she breathed more shallowly. When 3 had gone, she smiled, because sometimes the body lies when the soul grows afraid. She expected footsteps, the muted knock, the bowed head, the proof. She expected to feel relief the way a furnace feels oxygen. Relief is not the same as joy. Envy does not care. The huntsman returned near dark, carrying a small wooden box. He carried it the way a man carries a weight that is both heavy and empty. The queen did not ask him to sit. She took the box. She set it on the table where the red apple had sat last night. She lifted the lid. She did not blink. "Very good," she said, and any person listening for feeling would have found none. She did not eat that night. She was full of something else. The mirror watched with its lack of eyes. Truth waited, patient as a mountain. It had time. People do not have much time, but truth does. Snow White slept at last, on a bed of leaves beneath a pine that stitched its branches into a shelter just wide enough for one girl and a memory. Animals found her. They did not wake her. They curled near, the way warmth curls around a candle when the room is kind. A small brown deer laid its head on its own flank and breathed slow. A hedgehog made itself a stone and then, deciding it trusted sleep, uncurled. A nightjar called once and then forgot its own name. Morning would come. The dwarfs, who rose early to meet the mine like a friend who did not always know how to love you gently, would sing a song about work and soup. They would return to find a house that did not look exactly as they had left it. But that is tomorrow's story. Tonight, shadows tucked the castle in. The mirror cooled on its stand. The queen smiled into the dark and told herself the world had settled finally into the shape she liked. She did not notice that the shape had edges and that edges cut the hands that hold them. In the kitchen, the head cook stood alone and sliced an apple. Its white flesh turned brown at the edges, as apple flesh does when air touches it. He watched and thought of a girl who said thank you like a blessing. He put the slices in a pan with butter and cinnamon and made a tart that no one would eat, because grief makes the mouth forget. He set the tart on the sill to cool and hoped the scent would hurry a truth to wherever truths go. Far away beneath the pine, Snow White dreamed of a cottage with a door so low she would have to bow each time she entered, and of a table set for 7, and of laughter that sounded like stones tumbling down a hill in sunlight. She dreamed of being safe in a place where safety was small enough to hold, and the forest, which knows 1,000 ways to hide a heart from a hunter, stroked her hair with the night wind and kept its promise. Chapter 4. The Huntsman's Heart. Dawn rose like a soft breath across the treetops, and the world turned pale gold under a sky washed clean. Snow White followed the huntsman along a path only his boots seemed to know. He moved with the quiet of someone who had learned to place his weight where the earth would not complain. Birds stitched small sounds through the branches. A brook made a silver ribbons whisper out of stones. Snow White held her skirt clear of brambles and listened to the forest's gentle language, each rustle a word, each shadow a sentence that meant simply, keep going. They reached a hollow where oak roots knuckled up from the ground like old hands, and the light gathered into a green hush. The huntsman stopped. He did not look at her. He looked past her, through her, as if he wanted to see a future that didn't require the next few minutes. His breath came slow, methodical, the way a man breathes when he must steady everything he is. Rest here, he said, voice low, almost ashamed of itself for being needed. Snow White sat on a fallen trunk, cushioned with moss, and set her small basket by her feet. She unwrapped the cloth within, bread, a few berries, the narrow flask of water, and offered him the first piece. A kindness, as natural to her as a heartbeat. He didn't take it. Instead, he dropped to one knee as if a string had been cut. The moment cracked open. Words tumbled out of him, heavy and true. Forgive me, princess. The queen sent me to do a terrible thing. Snow White's fingers closed around the bread, then loosened. She didn't move away. She didn't cry out. She watched the way grief and shame shifted across his face, a weather pattern of a man's soul. To hurt me, she said softly. Not as a question, but as a way to put the sharpest thing on the table so it could not hide. His eyes shone like wet bark. He nodded. To end you, and bring your heart as proof. The final word fell between them and made the forest hold its breath. Silence filled with birds that didn't sing. Snow White placed the bread on the cloth and folded her hands in her lap. "Are you going to do it?" she asked. And there was no judgment in her voice, only the plainness of truth, which can be the kindest mercy. "No." He said it like a man tearing a net. "No." He stood and thrust his knife point first into the soil beside them, as if the earth itself could eat his obedience. "Run, please. Run where trees are friends and paths forget your footsteps. Do not come back to the castle." He swallowed, then added hoarsely, "I will find another heart. A boar. She will believe what she wants to believe." Snow White rose. For a heartbeat, she looked back the way they'd come. The path of duty, of habit, of home. Then forward into trees that smelled of sap and damp leaves. She touched the huntsman's sleeve, a touch as brief and bright as a match in the dark. "Thank you," she said. "Go," he whispered. She went. Branches wrote small scratches across her sleeves. Ferns drew wet green lines along her skirt. The forest shifted from pleasant to strange to something like a stern teacher who wanted to see effort, not fear. Snow White ran until her breath knotted and her pulse became the drum that carried her forward. When she could run no more, she walked. When walking was too loud, she crept. When creeping became fiddly and false, she stood still and listened. The forest answered by sending a robin to land on a twig near her shoulder. It cocked its head as if to say, "This way." She followed. Behind her, the huntsman pulled his knife free and wiped it clean, though it was clean already. He went deeper into the wood and found a boar drunk on acorns. He did what he had to do and did it quickly. He wrapped the heart in leaves that bled dark and carried it to a queen who needed to be convinced. When he presented the box, she did not ask how it had been done, only whether it had been done. "Very good," she said, and he left feeling like a man who had thrown a stone into a clear lake and could not bear to look at the ripples. The forest kept Snow White. It hid her from any eyes that didn't come kindly. It changed the way light fell so that she could read the ground, and it let her hear water where water ran. She cupped her hands and drank from a stream that tasted like coins and clouds. She bit a berry and learned the bright sour of survival. She walked until the green thinned, then thickened, then thinned again, and the air changed from damp earth to wood smoke and bread. Snow White lifted her head. Somewhere ahead, a chimney exhaled a small gray prayer. She followed it through a notch of trees and stepped into a clearing stitched with wildflowers and soft light. A cottage sat there as if someone had folded the story and tucked it under a hill, the roof low and moss-soft, the window small as yawned eyes, the door barely taller than her shoulder. Snow White wiped her palms against her skirt and breathed. She looked up at the sky and whispered, "Thank you." And the sky pretended it hadn't heard, the way generous things do. She went to the door and knocked. No one answered. She tried again, and when silence came back once more, polite, unhurried silence, she lifted the latch. The door opened with a little sigh, like a person who is relieved to see a friend. Chapter 5, Lost in the Woods. Before the cottage, there had been fear. Before fear, the frantic sprinting. Before sprinting, the moment in the huntsman's eyes when he chose to be a man rather than a tool. But the hour between leaving him and finding this clearing belonged to the forest alone. Snow White learned that every tree keeps a different kind of shadow. Birch shadows are light and playful, oak shadows steadfast and heavy, pine shadows full of old whispered secrets. She learned that paths make promises and then test you to see if you will keep them. She learned to pay attention to the ground, how leaves settled, how roots disguised themselves, how stones kept quiet, like monks. She also learned what loneliness feels like when it sits down beside you and says, "I will be here a while." To keep her courage soft and warm, Snow White spoke aloud, not loudly, but enough to make her own voice a companion. She told the trees what her mother had said about winter wishes and the window with the falling snow. She told a fox she didn't see but felt about the ribbon she wore today, the one she had tied as if fear could be woven into something useful. She thanked the stream for being cold and true. Gratitude is a way of hanging lanterns in the dark. Night had brushed its blue fingertips across the sky by the time the clearing appeared and the little house showed its small, patient face. Snow White stood very still so as not to frighten the peace she'd found. She listened to the chimney's slow exhale and the tiny clinks of cooling iron within. No voices, no footsteps, only the friendly breathing of a place that had worked all day and was resting. When no one answered her knock, she peered inside. Everything was small. Not toy small, not laugh small. Properly small, properly shaped for the hands and habits of someone not her size. A row of 7 stools lined the table like waiting smiles. 7 plates, 7 spoons, neatly placed. 7 cups upside down on a cloth. Along the opposite wall, 7 little beds, each with its own quilt pieced from scraps of color that remembered old shirts and older stories. Snow White stepped inside and, instinct, took off her shoes. Places know when you treat them politely. It wasn't exactly dirty, but it was the kind of messy that happens when everyone is too tired to do more than promise they'll do it tomorrow, she smiled. She could do something about that. She could pay for the shelter she was taking with the coin she carried best: care. She found a broom and let it show her the corners that liked to hoard crumbs. She washed the 7 plates with care as if they were made of glass and apology. She shook each quilt and tucked each bed tight, smoothing a hand down the last inch as if blessing a brow. She set bread to warm at the edge of the hearth and a pot of water to welcome the day. She moved quietly and slowly so as not to startle the house into remembering she was a stranger. Then Snow White sat, and the moment she sat, everything in her body agreed that sitting was at last allowed. The tightness in her calves unwound. The fidget in her shoulders sighed. Her hands found her lap. She meant to rest for a handful of heartbeats. She slept. Outside, the moon climbed a ladder of branches, and the clearing buttoned itself tight against cold. Forest things passed by and sniffed the air, bread, soap, girl, and carried on. Inside, the little house, grateful for company and clean corners, hummed a tune that only people with very small beds usually hear. And far away, a queen chewed her supper slowly, the way a person chews when she believes a thought tastes better if she makes it last. Chapter 6. The Little Cottage. The door swung open on the squeak of hinges that needed oil and patience. 7 shapes, lamplight behind them, tools on their shoulders, boots muddy with honest work, filled the threshold, jostling and whispering in voices tired enough to be gentle. "What's that smell?" one asked, nose lifted like a hound. "Clean," another said in a tone halfway between astonishment and gratitude. "And bread," a third sighed, almost reverently. They trooped in and stopped as one, a line of lanterns set carefully on a shelf. Not one cup left drying, not one spoon sulking by the basin. 7 neatly made beds, 7 tidy stools. And on the closest bed, curled like a comma between chapters, a sleeping girl. They looked at one another with the wordless conversation of people who have lived together long enough to keep complicated sentences short. Their eyes said, "What? And who? And also how wonderful, and also, is it safe?" "Let us sleep," said the tallest of the seven in a voice that held leader in it, the way iron holds strength. If trouble wanted us, it would have knocked louder. But trouble doesn't smell like bread and soap. Trouble doesn't tuck quilts or fold dishcloths with edges square as a promise. The tallest set his pick by the door. The others followed suit. Tools stacked in the right order, picks, shovels, lamps, because routines keep a house brave. "Who will wake her?" asked the one whose beard tangled like a thicket. "Not me," said the round-cheeked one, already reaching for the bread. "Careful," said the quietest dwarf, pushing the loaf back an inch. "She did that for us." "Then we'll do right by her," said the leader. He took a step closer and saw dirt on the hem of the girl's skirt. The honest dirt of a long walk. He saw the way her hand still curled as if holding a bird. He saw the face the world told in lullabies, fair as first snow, hair dark as midnight with no moon, lips the ruby red of a cut apple. But he didn't see a story. He saw a person who looked like someone who would return tools to their hooks. "Princess," he tried softly. Then, realizing that was both too much and possibly wrong, corrected himself with a smile. "Miss?" Snow White stirred, eyelashes brushing her cheeks like small shadows waking. She blinked again, sat up, then looked at the seven of them as if she had told herself a hope that might be true. "Hello," she said, the word warm as bread. "Hello," they answered, chorused but not rehearsed. "I'm so sorry," she said, standing quickly. "I knocked, and no one came, and I didn't mean to take your beds or your air. I only meant to tidy up the thanks I owe you." "You owe us nothing," said the one with the kindest eyes, "but we accept everything you gave." The names came like the colors in their quilts, each one a piece of the whole. The leader who made decisions feel like good ideas. The steady one who remembered mending. The anxious one who kept spare candles in 3 places. The quiet one who always heard the kettle just before it boiled. The cheerful one who could coax a grin from a cloud. The thoughtful one who liked to count stars. And the stubborn one whose stubbornness was alloyed with a loyalty so strong it could bend iron. Snow White told them her name because names are what you offer when you are asking to be trusted. She told them as much of her story as would fit into the space between a pot being set on the hook and the steam lifting its first sweet ghost into the air. She did not say murder, did not say heart, did not say alone, though all 3 words sat quietly at the table and ate with them. The dwarfs listened with their whole faces, nodding at the right times, keeping still at the hard parts. When she finished, the leader took a breath that sounded like deciding. "Stay," he said simply. "Stay here." "We rise early," added the thoughtful one apologetically, as if their schedules might scare her away. "I can rise earlier," Snow White said. "We work long days," said the steady one. "I can work longer," she answered, and meant tenderly, not harder. "We don't have a mirror," confessed the anxious one, as if that might be a problem. Snow White smiled, relief loosening her shoulders. "Good," she said. They found her a dress that had been sewn for someone taller but folded easily. They showed her which stool creaked and which cup liked to tip if not placed exactly so. They told her about the mine, how it asked for care the way a horse asks for good hands, how it gave up stones only to those who didn't grab, how singing kept the tunnels friendly. "You sing?" one asked. "Yes," Snow White said, surprised to realize how much she had missed it. "Sing here?" he asked, as shy as a child offering a toy. So she did. A simple song, nothing fancy, the kind of tune that bubbles up when work is honest and hands are busy. The rhythm for sweeping, the tune for stirring, the soft lilt note you hum when laying quilts straight. The house listened. then joined. Floorboards with their soft creak, spoons tapping polite rhythms, a kettle adding its thin whistle like a distant cousin of a bird. The dwarfs smiled at one another over the rims of their cups. The house smiled too, and the night outside drew closer, pressed its ear to the window panes, and decided this was a story worth staying for. Chapter 7. 7 Dwarfs Return. Morning began long before the sun arrived. The mind keeps its own time, and anyone who loves it learns to bend. The dwarfs, dressed in silence, threaded with small jokes, rituals repeated until they were as easy as breath. Snow White had already kindled the fire and set porridge to bloom into comfort. She placed 7 bowls in a neat row and a smaller one for herself at the end, not because her hunger was smaller, but because her gratitude wanted to be last in line. They ate the way contented people eat, without hurry, without waste, with the occasional soft clink of spoon against bowl and the occasional sigh that means, this is good enough to get us to noon. Snow White wrapped bundles for them, bread, a wedge of cheese, an apple each, and tucked a little sprig of thyme into every cloth, because thyme smells like courage when the day is tight. Rules, said the leader gently after they had eaten, and before they had shouldered their tools. He cleared his throat, trying to dress care and authority. Do not open the door to strangers. Do not speak to peddlers. Do not try new things alone. If a thing looks almost too lovely to be real, it probably is. Wait for us. Snow White nodded. I will wait. Keep singing, added the cheerful one, as if the song itself might be a lock on the door. I will, she promised, and that was the easiest of vows. They left in a brave line, and the clearing sighed after them. Snow White tidied what little there was left to tidy, then stood in the doorway and looked toward the sliver of path that led to the world that had ended yesterday. She stepped back in and set herself to the task of being a good guest until she realized, with a small jump of the heart, that the word had changed. Not guest, family. She swept the walk and the place where boots always shook off mud. She washed the windows until the morning could see itself more clearly. Birds came and sat like punctuation along the sill. A family of field mice took possession of the far left corner under the cabinet, with the dignity of tenants paying rent in crumbs. Snow White left them a seed and a warning, and everyone understood the terms. Then came the animals from deeper in the wood, squirrels with hands like prayers, rabbits with ears like 2 gentle questions, a shy deer with a nose that wrote soft circles in the air. They gathered at the edge of courage, the place between wild and home, and watched the girl who moved like a lullaby. She sang as she worked, the wash song, the rinse song, the clap the towel hard out the door song, then the folding song that makes cloths lie flat as lake water. She sang the stew song while cutting carrots into coins and potatoes into hearth-warm moons. She sang the bread song while kneading, push, fold, turn, push, fold, turn. The old rhythm that turns flour and water and hope into something that sustains. The house kept the beat. Outside, the forest listened and remembered the last time anyone sang so trustingly within earshot of its oldest trees. By afternoon, the cottage was not just clean, it was ready. The table set, the hearth fed, the floor swept, the air carrying the pink-cheeked smell of baking. Snow White sat on the step with her hands idle for the first time and let the sun decorate her. The deer stepped closer, encouraged by stillness. Hello, she said, and the word left her mouth like a gift wrapped in ribbon. A rustle from the path, the dwarfs returning, their laughter arriving before their boots. They carried the mine on them, dust bright as stars on their sleeves, the satisfied slump of shoulders that had worked and were willing to work again tomorrow. The leader saw the bread on the sill and grinned. The anxious one saw the latch firmly set and sighed happily. The thoughtful one saw the quiet joy on Snow White's face and relaxed the way a map relaxes once you've found the X. They washed at the basin, each small face lifted to meet the cool, and sat down to a meal that would have made a king envy the taste of honest onion and the feel of a spoon on a tired tongue. They told stories in turns, passing the day along the table like a jug. Snow White learned their favorite parts. The stubborn one's argument with a particularly opinionated boulder, the quiet one's listening to a seam of quartz that sung when tapped, the cheerful one's insistence that their lantern had winked at him. And who could say it hadn't? Us, she said, nodding to their we and we and we. Us, they echoed, like a toast you make to the ground you stand on. Before the last light, the leader repeated the rules, not because he didn't trust her or because he loved the sound of his own caution, but because love repeats itself so you never have to wonder if it's still true. Snow White nodded, solemn and sure. I will remember, she said. They slept behind their 7 little curtains, and she slept behind her own made of stitched-together dishcloths that somehow became a canopy. The house slept, and the clearing stood guard. The forest kept its old secrets and listened for new ones. Far away, a queen set her goblet down, visited her mirror, and asked the same old question because people who live on envy must refill their cup every night. Who is the fairest of them all? The mirror, which could not lie even to save a life, answered, Snow White. And rage, when it has proper fuel, burns so clean you can't see it smoke. Chapter 8. A Life Among the Dwarfs. Snow White's days braided themselves into a routine sturdy enough to hold the week. Morning, the breakfast hymn, porridge arranged in neat little bowls, packed lunches tied with time and trust. Midday, washing and mending, visits from animals who pretended they had errands and stayed for the song, a little nap with her cheek on her forearm when the sun slipped friendly through the window. Afternoon, stew or soup, bread or oatcakes, a pie if the forest had been generous with berries. Evening, 7 voices returning, the room filling with the bright clatter of tools and stories, the good tired that makes sleep taste like mercy. She learned each dwarf's habits the way you learn a dear friend's preferred cup. The leader liked his spoon at the 2 o'clock position. No one knows why, not even him. The steady one checked the latch twice, then once more only with his eyes. The anxious one worried the corner of the table when he lied, and he lied only to make a bad thing sound less bad. The quiet one collected small polished stones that fit perfectly between his fingers and his thoughts. The cheerful one taught Snow White a nonsense tune about turnips. The thoughtful one counted long things, days, seasons, size, while the stubborn one made lists and pretended he hadn't. In return, they learned her, how she hummed when she was thinking and went silent when she was praying, how she shook the last drops from a washed cup with exactly 4 flicks, how she saved the crust for last, not out of thrift, but because she liked the way it felt to finish with something sturdy. They told her the mine's rules. Never trust a tunnel you haven't greeted aloud. Never turn your back on a seam before saying thank you. Never let your song stop in the middle, or the rock will think you're lying. She told them the kitchen's rules. Salt early, not late. Always start onions in a cold pan. Wipe the table as if it were someone's forehead. At night, before the fire drowsed into coals, they played a game that lives wherever people are family. The best of today. The stubborn one, pretending he didn't care, always went last. Snow White always chose something small. Sun on the kettle, the field mouse's return, the leader's rare, unguarded laugh, the accents of a day that could have been ordinary and wasn't because they were together inside it. And yet, The dwarf's rules existed for a reason. The forest was kind, yes, but it was not naive. The world beyond their clearing still held a woman with a mirror and a hunger sharpened thin enough to pass for grace. One morning, after the men had gone, and after Snow White had sung the washing song and the floor song and the Here We Go bread song, there came a knock. It wasn't the kind of knock you fear, the bang, bang, bang of urgency or the sly tap, tap of someone who wants in without being noticed. It was a grandmother knock, a neighbor knock, oh, I have something useful knock. Snow White dried her hands and stood very still. Rules, she reminded herself. Rules are love traveling ahead of danger. Who is it? She called, voice light. The way one speaks to a bird you hope will land on your hand. A poor peddler woman, wheezed a voice from the other side of the door. Ribbons and laces, sweet girl. New patterns for old dresses. Take a look, no harm in looking. A pause, then a cough that sounded real because it was. Snow White looked at the latch, then at the window, then at the table where 7 bundles of time slept in their little knots. I cannot open the door, she said. But I wish you a very good day. Of course you can't, the voice agreed at once, shrewdly reading caution and trying not to scare it away. Wise girl. Wise men in your life. But what about the window, my dove? Open it just a crack, and let an old woman show you her wares. No touching, only looking. No harm in looking. Snow White glanced at the little animals gathered like punctuation marks along the sill. The deer lifted its head and blew out a worried breath. The rabbit's ears wrote, wait. Snow White felt the rules settle like a shawl on her shoulders. But she also felt pity. A thread pulled by a cough, a hunched back, a basket carried far. Only looking, she said, and unlatched the window. Chapter 9. Mirror's Truth. We must go back a few hours to a room without windows, but with a mirror that makes windows unnecessary. The queen had slept like someone whose stomach was full and whose soul was still ravenous. She rose, robed herself in patience, and went to the glass that never flatters. Who is the fairest of them all? The ritual felt like a prayer with a blade hidden in it. Snow White, said the mirror, and the queen's name fell out of the sentence the way a bad stone falls out of a peach. For a moment, the queen's face was not beautiful. It was a map of all the roads she had taken that didn't lead where she wanted. Then she made it beautiful again, the way a butcher makes meat look like a rose. Impossible. A child's word, a tyrant's word. The mirror said nothing else. Truth has no synonyms. The queen did not scream. She did not smash the frame or claw at the silver. She turned instead to the place where she kept the darker tools, pots that remembered poisonous leaves, books that had once been trees in a forest no bird sang in, powders in little jars whose labels had been written by hands that shook. She moved briskly, like a mother getting ready for a trip. She made a disguise with the ease of someone who had put on too many different faces to know which was hers. Stoop back, ragged shawl, hands painted into age, a voice practice, cough, breath, a little bit of fun to sweeten a lie. She laced her basket with ribbons, laces, trifles to prove she was harmless. And beneath it, in a small square box, the tools for a bodice lace that did not loosen once it was tied. Old ways first, she murmured to herself, smiling at the memory of cruel midwives and stupid lords. Apples later. She left the castle by a gate that never opens for good reasons and crossed the distance between envy and intent, like someone who has paved the road with her own wrong choices. The forest saw her coming and did what forests do when danger wears a face that looks familiar. It warned anyone who would listen. But she had planned for warnings. She tucked her malice under a wheeze. She knocked, as if she didn't know how to knock any other way, and found a window that opened an inch. The queen smiled behind her wrinkles and held up her prettiest ribbons and her most respectable laces. "Only looking," she promised. "Only looking," Snow White echoed. "Here," said the peddler. "Lean closer. Let me see what suits your coloring, sweet lamb." Snow White leaned carefully, trusting in the rule that had become her friend. Do not touch. The rabbits flattened their ears. The squirrel put both hands over its eyes. The deer stamped once, soft thunder. "You could be lovelier still," the peddler murmured, with grandmotherly wonder. "Allow me to show you a new lacing. No touching, just, there. Do you mind if I, through the window, tie it for you? Such delicate work. My hands know only this one good thing anymore. Rules are love, but pity undoes knots even rules cannot see." Chapter 10. The first disguise, the peddler woman. Snow White hesitated. The ribbon in her bodice had loosened a little during sweeping. It would be useful to tighten it. And the woman's hands, though wrinkled, moved with the memory of competence. Snow White measured. The window was between them. The dwarfs would be home before dusk. She would not open the door. She would not eat, drink, or take anything in her hands. "Just through the window," she said. "And then you must go." Of course, the peddler crooned. And before the animals could object, in a language louder than their bodies, she had threaded a new lace, bright, strong, ordinary to any eye that did not know malice, and set her fingers to work. "Breathe in," said the old woman. Snow White did. The lace tightened, quick and mean. "Again," rasped the voice, which sounded less grandmother now and more order. Snow White tried, but the bodice had already stolen the breath meant for the next breath. She made the small noise a kettle makes when it runs out of water. There, the peddler said, and pulled once more, a final yank that sealed the trick. Snow White's hands flew to her chest. Her eyes widened in the way eyes widen when air is a closed door. She swayed. Beauty takes a little sacrifice. The peddler smiled and stepped back, already gathering her basket, already turning, already wanting to be seen, leaving nothing but a lesson. Snow White fell as gently as a person can fall when the world rushes away from her. The animals came at once, deer nosing her shoulder, rabbits needing her fingers to move, birds pecking at the knot that would not admit it was a knot. The peddler was halfway to the trees, whistling an old tune that remembered better people. The forest shifted. A fox ran. A squirrel found the dwarfs a little sooner than it would have on an ordinary afternoon. The dwarfs read the news in the way branches snapped and birds scolded and hurried home, with the mines still dusting their cuffs. They found her on the floor beyond the window, the room tidy, the day beautiful, the girl very still. No marks, no poison-ripe smell, only the terrible tension of someone corseted by cruelty. The leader's hands were sure. The stubborn one's knife was already in his fist. The quiet one spoke to her softly while they cut. The anxious one stood in the doorway and watched the path with a hate he had never needed to use before. The lace gave. Air re-entered the room like forgiveness. Snow White's eyes opened. Her first breath was ugly and perfect. She coughed and coughed until her chest remembered breath was a practice, not a prize. "I'm sorry," she rasped when she could speak. "I thought..." She looked. "Rules," the leader said, but not unkindly. "Rules are love that shows up before we can." Snow White nodded and pressed her palms to her cheeks, feeling the heat of being alive. "I will not open the window again," she said, and heard how the promise made the house taller. They burned the wicked lace in the hearth and watched the smoke write an apology against the stone. They checked the latch 3 times. They moved the table an inch closer to the door, for reasons that made sense only to people who loved one another and wanted the world to see the fact the moment it stepped inside. That night, the dwarfs ate slowly and spoke less. Not because there was nothing to say, but because their hearts were busy saying something else. Stay, live. Stay, live. Far away, a queen asked her mirror the wrong question and was given the right answer. Snow White lived. Snow White was fairer. Snow White's name was an avalanche that buried the queen's patience. Apples, then, she whispered. And the mirror, which had learned long ago that its words are stones thrown into ponds it did not make, said nothing at all. Chapter 11. The Comb of Doom. Morning wore the color of milk and ash. Snow White opened the shutters to greet the day, then closed them again, and set the latch with the seriousness of someone placing a crown on a promise. After the first disguise, she had said the words that turned a house into a small fortress. I will not open the window again. The dwarfs had left with lunch bundles and time tucked like courage in their knots. The clearing had settled into its usual hush, stitched with birdsong and the cluck of the kettle. Snow White scrubbed the table in circles that made the wood shine like a well-kept story. She sang the washing song, the bread song, the towel flap like a flag song. The house listened and hummed back. Near noon, a shadow crossed the sill and paused. Not the broad, bold shadow of a stranger stepping close. A smaller one, hesitant at first, then bold in its own shy way. Snow White looked up. On the threshold sat a basket. No knock. No voice. Just the basket and the quiet, bright suggestion of ribbon ends winking from within. She stayed where she was. Rules, she reminded her heart, are love when love cannot be in the room. The deer lifted its head from the far edge of the clearing. The rabbits made their ears into little upright prayers. A finch ticked against the window frame like a clock reminding the day not to hurry. Who leaves a basket? Snow White asked softly. Not to break the hush, but to honor it with words. A woman shuffled into view at last, bent, shawled, with a face the color of bread that had fallen into the fire, then been brushed off and pretended fine. The peddler, yes, yet not the same peddler. Different shawl, different stoop. The same old cleverness, dressed in new wrinkles. "Sweet girl," the woman called from 3 paces away, careful to remain beyond arm's reach of the door. Her voice arrived through air like a hand not quite offered. No need to open. No need for a coin. These are gifts from a road-worn heart. Combs and pins for a head that deserves a little joy. She nudged the basket with her toe, a modest gesture practiced to look unpracticed. I leave them whether anyone comes or not. The forest will dress itself if you won't. No touch, no window, no door. The queen had learned the shape of Snow White's promise and bent herself around it like wire. Snow White stood very still. The basket sat very quiet. The combs within flashed a little, not with magic, just with the innocent way polished horn catches sun. Leave them there, Snow White said, voice gentle. Thank you for thinking of me. Think of you, the old woman chuckled, a sound dragged over gravel. Child, the woods thought of you. The birds thought of you, and I, an old body with a short road left, thought I might leave beauty where beauty already lives. She coughed, and the cough was a real cough. Lies are safest when braided into breath that does not need permission to be believed. No payment, she repeated, as if generosity were a habit she could not break. Snow White watched the basket like a cat watches snowfall, alert but not unkind. She waited. Patience, she had learned, protects like a wall that does not look like a wall. The old woman, seeing no door unlatch, dipped her head and withdrew into trees with a shuffle that said, "I meant no harm, but I always take my time leaving." The basket remained. Minutes lengthened, then loosened and went their soft way. Bread rose. A pot blinked to boil. The basket sat, making its case with silence. Snow White put on her shawl and stepped to the threshold without crossing it. "If you are a gift," she told the basket, "you may come in only after the sun moves past the upper oak and my friends return. Those are the rules. If you are not a gift, the forest will take you back." The basket, being wicker, did not answer. The sun climbed. The house smelled of stew. The combs lay like small moons among ribbon. Afternoon bent toward evening. Snow White, thinking of the dwarf's tired hands and dust-bright sleeves, thought also of their hair, how the cheerful one's curls never decided where to be, how the thoughtful one's bangs kept falling into his sums. "A comb for them," she said softly. "Not for me." The idea felt like a key that opened a door inside her resolve without breaking any locks. She took a long-handled broom and hooked the basket's rim. She lifted it over the sill without once crossing the threshold, keeping a distance that would have made a wary bird proud. She set it on the floor and stepped back as if it were a fox that needed space to remember it wasn't tamed. She waited still more. Stew bubbled. The rabbits tapped a warning on the plank with their small, careful feet. The deer stamped once and shook off worry like rain. Snow White knelt, slid a long wooden spoon beneath the top layer of ribbon, and lifted a single comb onto a folded cloth. Not in hair, not near skin. Cloth first, then comb, then eyes. It was pretty, carved in a pattern of leaves and small stars, the teeth even and delicate. She smiled despite herself. "The cheerful one will look splendid," she told the spoon. The comb's prettiness was honest and did not know what it was carrying. The door latch lifted. "Back," said a chorus of small friends, their bodies a flurry of punctuation. "I know," she promised, and meant it. She was not moving to put the comb in her hair. She was moving to place it on the high shelf where gifts waited until the dwarfs could bless or banish them. But the queen, who had not gone far, had planned for a shelf. She knew the impatient little reach a pretty thing invites. She had smeared a whisper of charm along the comb's spine. Nothing loud, nothing that sparkled. Just a nudge that said, "Try me in the nearest strand. Feel how I smooth." Snow White's hand rose without entirely belonging to her. Not possession, temptation. The smallest tilt, the smallest tuck. One loop of hair at the temple. A testing touch the way one tests water with a fingertip. The comb kissed scalp. The world folded clean and swift. Light narrowed to a thread and slipped away. The comb remained where it had landed, black in the gloss of her hair. The animals scattered toward the path. The stew forgot itself and tried to boil over. The house called with a pop of the kettle lid and the hard exhale of the bellows. Far down the trail, the dwarfs were already hurrying, their deep sense of the day tugged by an absence at its center. They burst into the clearing as the sun let go of the topmost branch and night song took its place. They knew at a glance. The leader saw the comb. The stubborn one's knife was out as if it had been there all afternoon. The quiet one knelt and spoke to Snow White's cheek, while the anxious one kept the door like a shield. The thoughtful one climbed on the bench to reach her temple with care that made his hands look older and kinder than they were. The comb came free. Air re-entered the room like a forgiven mistake. Snow White gasped, the sound clumsy and perfect, and rolled onto her side as if the world had tipped her onto its gentler hip. "I didn't open the window," she managed. shame and defense sharing a breath. I didn't. Rules are not only about doors, the leader said softly, brushing hair back from her brow. They are also about waiting to be less alone. I thought to give the comb to you, she whispered. And we will be glad to share all gifts, said the cheerful one, after the word safe signs them. They burned the basket and the ribbons on a flat stone under an old sky and watched the smoke write its small apology to the clearing. They sat closer than usual that night. No stories, just the comfort of bodies that meant no harm to one another. In a far room, the queen asked her mirror for mercy in the form she preferred. Am I the fairest? No, said Truth. Snow White. The queen's smile thinned to a blade you could shave a lie with. Then we are done being subtle, she said to the dark. We will be bright. Chapter 12. The Poisoned Apple. The queen had saved this trick for last because it satisfied both her hunger and her sense of theater. Apples carry a story in their skin. They look like endings and beginnings both. She chose the perfect fruit, rounded as a promise, red as a ribbon, white-green where stem met memory. She sat with her jars and herbs, her spindly pens and whispering books, and coaxed a sleeping poison into one half of the apple, letting the other stay harmless. There is a special cruelty in halves. She practiced a new voice, thinner now, almost merry. She sewed a different dress, uglier but cleaner, respectable, in a way meant to disarm suspicion without inviting pity. She set a cake in her basket beside the apple. Proof, she told herself, always tastes better than a claim. When she set out, the mirror turned its face to its own dark, as if it did not want to watch the road she took. Snow White's day began with the usual care and one new vow. No baskets, no combs, no kindness accepted from the hands of strangers. She braided her hair and tied the braid's end with the ribbon that had once held fear. She felt strong. Strength is not stubbornness. It is clarity that doesn't need to shout. Mid-morning, a voice trilled from the path. Good day. Good day to the tidy house and the tidy heart. I bake cakes that sing your name when you cut them, and I grow apples that taste like the piece of sky in your mouth when you laugh. Snow White smiled despite herself at the wording. Good day, she called, but stayed behind the door. I cannot open, grandmother. I am safe here. Of course, the voice danced, like a string pulled across a fiddle. I only wish to share how fine this morning is. See? I have cut a slice for you, sealed and wrapped. No touch between us, only the air. Eat it at your leisure. No harm in a slice. Snow White did not open. She did not lift a latch. She thought of the dwarfs, their questions and care, and she thought of promises. Thank you, she said, but I have enough. May your day be sweet. The woman laughed, and the laugh was almost pleasant in its falseness. Then let us share a different joy. I will sit here on the stump. You sit there inside your door. We will each take a bite of an apple at the same time. If mine harms me, you will know yours is no friend. If mine does not, you may enjoy the sun with me for one crisp bite. Two women admiring what trees make. No touch, no trade, only proof. Snow White hesitated. Proof. That old seducer of the careful glittered like a fish. Only one bite, the old woman coaxed. You have a house full of rules. Let one small tasting be the way the day is kind to you. The animals shifted, fretful, but even the deer could not argue elegantly with proof. The dwarves had not forbidden all food forever. They had forbidden strangers at doors, bargains with unknown hands, gifts that needed thanks before evening. Snow White took a breath and tested what fear and wisdom made together. She lifted the latch on the tiniest window at the very top of the door, the one not even a hand could fit through, and reached a ribboned hook through. The woman placed the apple delicately in the hook's crook, like a falconer settling a bird. Snow White drew it in, wiped it with a cloth because her mother had taught her that cloth is the first prayer, and then held it where the light could tell her if anything was wrong. Nothing shouted. The apple wore innocence like skin. Now, trilled the woman beyond the door. Together, one bite each. Snow White heard a crunch. She watched the shadow beyond the threshold tilt its head as chewing turned to humming, a humming of enjoyment. The old woman swallowed and held up the remaining white-green crescent, as if to say, "See? See?" She smiled with red-tinted lips that looked like someone else's mouth. Snow White took the smallest bite she'd ever taken in her life, a child's careful first bite of a sweet that might be too much. The apple broke softly. Juice touched her tongue, bright, clean, impossible to fear, and truth snapped shut without a sound. The piece of fruit lodged in a breath that no longer knew how to be taken. There was no lacing to cut, no comb to pluck. Her body folded into itself like a letter sealed at last. The cloth she held slipped from her fingers and fell with a sigh that might have been her own if she'd had time to make it. Outside, the old woman's humming became a chuckle that remembered younger, crueler days. She set her cake on the stump and smoothed her skirt as if to erase any evidence that she had knelt to place death inside a girl's mouth. "Rest well," she said to the wood and door. "Let this be a lesson on the cost of being lovely." She walked away. If the forest clawed at her hem, she shook it loose. If birds tried to tangle her hair with panic, she brushed them off like gnats. She carried her empty basket as a trophy, as if absence weighed less than a heart in a box. The clearing held its breath so long the air went thin. Then all at once everything moved. The kettle knocked its lid. The deer leapt. The birds wrote 3 frantic sentences in the sky and flew down the path toward the mine. The dwarfs ran before they knew they were running. The leader's stride counted the beats of a song he never wanted to sing again. The stubborn one's jaw set in a line that made him look older than the mountains that held his tunnels. The anxious one prayed to a god he had not bothered with when days were ordinary. The cheerful one did not make a joke. The thoughtful one forgot his sums. They found Snow White near the door, the little cloth like a small white flag under her hand. Her face was not broken by pain. It was not anything except very, very quiet. "That's apple," said the leader, voice the size of a pin. He saw the bitten crescent on the table. He saw the innocent red curve that held no threat, and knew the way miners know that poison hides where stone looks most honest. He sliced the apple. He sniffed. He tasted the other side, a pinprick on his tongue, then spat, washing his mouth with water that remembered snow. He shook his head. "No antidote we can find," he said. Not to give up, but to stop lying. The quiet one laid his ear to Snow White's chest and listened for a city there, for traffic and bells and the ordinary clatter of a heart. He heard silence that sounded like snowfall. He was very gentle when he lifted her head and smoothed her hair, as if quiet could bruise if handled roughly. They tried everything love could invent in a hurry. Warm cloths, cold cloths, prayers that had never been said out loud, the anxious one's charm, a smooth blue stone his mother had pressed into his fist when he was small with the words, "For when the world forgets, you belong in it." They held the stone with her fingers and felt nothing pass between. When the day had gone and the night did not bother pretending it would be merciful, the leader said what no one else could bear to say. "She is not dead," he insisted quietly, because to declare death is to throw a door wide open, and they would not do that to her. "But she is not here." He looked around the little room that had become a cathedral. We will not put her where the earth will forget her. We'll keep her, said the stubborn one, with the kind of finality that can talk a storm out of crossing a field. Where she can see the sky, added the thoughtful one. Where we can see her, whispered the quiet one. They did not sleep. They kept the lamps lit and the window open and the door locked and the stew warm, because rituals ease the body when the heart cannot be eased. They waited the night through, taking turns telling stories to a girl who could not hear, in case stories could lean into a place that medicine could not reach. In a room across the valley, a mirror answered a question none of them could hear. "You are the fairest," it told the queen, and watched the woman sag with relief that tasted nothing like grace. "Good," she said, "good," as if the word could turn jealousy into law. Chapter 13, A Glass Coffin. Spring stepped aside and let summer pass. Summer handed the year to autumn with hands stained sweet with fruit. Autumn folded itself into winter. The dwarfs did not measure time the way they had before. They measured it by the softness of the ferns around the clearing, by the warmth of the sun on the glass in the afternoons, by the way shadows lay when the day had been kind and when it had not. They built a coffin that was not a coffin. It was a promise made visible. Glass, so that the sky could see her, and she could see it if seeing still lived in her sleep. A frame of wood they carved with the animals that kept watch, the herbs she liked, the small kitchen tools that had turned their house into a place with a heart in it. Across the base, in letters careful as prayer, they cut her name, Snow White. Below that, they wrote the sentence they had agreed upon, as if it were part of the world's grammar: "She is loved." They brought her outside and laid her where a birch leaned its white shoulder like a friend. They set the glass over, not to keep her in, never that, but to keep the weather gentle and the curious respectful. Birds nested nearby, as if interrupting grief with life would be a kindness. The deer came, then brought her fawn, then brought that fawn's fawn. The fox curled where he could see and not be seen. Sometimes the bear passed in the night, heavy as a blessing, and did not touch anything. The dwarfs went to the mine and came home again. They told her what they found, a vein of quartz that sang louder than usual, a seam that crumbled kindly, a stubborn rock that had taught them patience by refusing to move until the right song opened it. They set bread on the sill and porridge on the coals, and, on some mornings, a cup beside the glass, because hope is practical that way. Villagers came in twos and threes. They did not crowd. They stood as if in a church, voices low, hats in their hands. They had heard the tale and they had embroidered it, the way people do when sorrow needs a little lace so it can be carried. They brought small gifts that would not rot, carved birds that would not fly away, soft ribbons to tie to branches so the tree could remember that it was loved, little jars of honey sealed against time. The leader thanked them with a nod that meant, "You have found a way to be kind that does not ask anything of her." Winter draped herself across the clearing with the dignity of an old aunt making a bed. Snow feathered the glass lightly. The dwarfs brushed it away with a broom so small it looked like a toy and was not. They laid a wool cloak across the glass, though they knew it could not reach her. Kindness often knows it cannot reach. It offers itself anyway. On the longest night, they sang. Not carols, not psalms. Work songs, table songs, songs about onions and boots, and the way a day tastes when you come home through cold, and there is a light that means you are wanted. They sang to remind themselves that lives are made of ordinary threads, and that Snow White had woven theirs into something they would not undo even if they could. In the deep heart of winter, the forest stilled so completely The dwarfs' breaths looked like little clouds kneeling. The mirror across the valley looked at a woman who had spent her triumph fast and found herself hungry again. Fairest, it still said, because the truth had not found a way to wake a sleeping girl yet. The queen smiled and did not notice how much her smile resembled a flinch. The first thaw came shyly, a thin trickle under the crust, a cheeky drip off the eave, a robin that forgot itself and sang. The dwarfs counted the days by how many times they had to sweep the glass. Soon they were complaining about pollen instead of snow. Complaint is a way the living prove they are still here. One afternoon, when the light wore the exact gold that always made Snow White look most like herself, a rider paused at the far line of trees. The horse lifted its head the way animals do when they catch the scent of a story. The rider slid to the ground and led the horse forward slowly, as if approaching a shore. He was not wearing a crown. Crowns are heavy and he was traveling. But you would have known him anyway. He walked like a person who had learned that people step aside for him and who wished they would not. His face held both a mother's sweetness and a father's expectation. His hands were calloused in the places reins make tough and soft in the places books make curious. He stopped when he saw her. People always stopped when they saw her, even when she had been awake. Now the stop was not awe, it was ache. The dwarfs watched from a polite distance. The leader stepped forward because someone had to measure the first words. "Good evening," he said, as if this were an ordinary visit and the ordinary rules would keep the world honest. The rider bowed. "Good evening, He swallowed, and the swallow had the clink of armor in it, even though he wore none. "I heard a tale," he said, "of a maiden kept beneath glass, so that the weather would know to be kind. Stories are often foolish. This one is foolish and true." "It is," agreed the leader. "May I—" The rider stopped again and let respect pull him back a pace. "May I sit?" he asked instead. "Please," said the quiet one, who had been listening to the rider's voice for fear instead of music, and had heard no sharpness there. The prince sat. He did not touch the glass. He did not sigh loudly, though his chest knew how. He told Snow White a story, how he had once heard singing in a palace garden years ago, and the song had turned a dull afternoon into an orchard. He told her how he had looked for that voice in courtrooms, cloisters, markets, where technicolor fabrics snapped in wind, and in the plain squares of villages where women sold eggs and old men played draughts, and everyone knew each other's names. He had not found it. He had almost stopped looking. The dwarves, hearing the thread, did not cut it. They let the story tie itself to the glass like a ribbon in a child's hair. "May I come again?" the prince asked at last. He did not add, "May I carry her away like a prize?" because the thought embarrassed him when he felt it. He asked only for the permission people ask when they are trying to be gentler than they have been taught. "You may," said the leader. He came again, and again. He did not come every day because he had a kingdom and a father with maps, but he came as often as men who carry duty like a yoke let themselves love a thing that has no border. Spring unrolled itself fully, green as forgiveness. The prince asked a different question then, not from greed, not even from hope, but from a desire to care and to stop asking the dwarfs to care without relief. "If I were to build a little chapel," he began, then shook his head as if to clear away presumption. "If I were to keep watch in my own place, would you permit me to bear her there?" He lifted both hands empty. "I would not hide her. I would not stop you coming. I would not own what cannot be owned. But I would sing some of the songs and fetch some of the water and take some of the night hours so you may sleep." The dwarfs did not answer quickly. They carried the question like a hot loaf between them, passing it hand to hand until it was cool enough to taste. In the end, it was not his lineage that decided them, or his gentleness, or the fact that he had never once banged on the glass and demanded miracles. It was the way he had said chapel and watch and we. The stubborn one nodded first. The quiet one closed his eyes and saw Snow White under a different sky and did not feel fear there. The leader said, "Yes, if you carry her as if she were made of mourning." "I will," the prince promised, and if promises could wake the sleeping, that one might have. Chapter 14, The Prince's Search. His road back to the palace did not feel like a return. It felt like an errand sent by the part of himself he trusted most. He told his father only what a man must tell a king, that there was a duty he asked to share, that it involved no border or treaty, that it would cost attention and patience and very little coin. The king squinted with one eye, then the other, as if changing angles might change the truth. "Your mother would have understood sooner," he said finally, which was permission disguised as a reproach. He sent carpenters and glaziers and men with hands that knew how to build a small shelter that wanted to be a shrine without daring to say so. The prince returned with them and did not give orders so much as ask for opinions in the right places. "Not there," said the thoughtful dwarf. "The ground sings too loud." "Not under that branch," said the quiet one. "It dumps its winter in one gust that will scare the bees." "Here," said the leader, in the patch where grass had already learned to be soft. "And nowhere else." The men set posts that learned the weight of grief and the balance of hope. The prince kept company as they worked, fetching, carrying, holding, familiar labor for a body trained to shape a day rather than merely ride it. When the walls stood thin and respectful, when the roof sat like a hand that knows not to press, when the windows were set to catch dawn and send it like a letter to the floor, then they moved the coffin. They did it the way you move a sleeping child, whispering without words, apologizing to furniture, holding breath through doorways. The dwarves each took a corner. The prince walked beside, his hand under the glass without touching it, like a promise that has learned its own limits. In the little chapel, they set Snow White down and the room learned its purpose. People came, not crowds, choirs of 2 and 3 again, and sometimes a woman alone who did not cry until she saw the glass. The prince sat often and spoke to Snow White of the things that make a life from the inside. The bread he had eaten that reminded him of childhood, the way a foal had fallen asleep on its knees, the letter from his cousin telling the worst joke and the best secret. He told her about the dwarfs, their precise tediums and careful joys, and about the way the clearing felt like a lung with its own breath. He told her about his mother, the story he had not said to anyone but the sky, that she had been the kindest person in a palace that had almost talked him out of believing in kindness, and that he had been searching for the sound of her voice in the world since it went quiet. "Yours," he said, "was that sound." He said her name, often, not to make it his, but to keep it alive where air could hear it. Time lengthened and braided. The prince's guards learned to leave him alone there. The king learned to stop asking if the mirror-mad queen across the valley had done anything worth riding out for. The dwarfs learned the route between clearing and chapel by heart, and learned that their hearts could be in 2 places without tearing. In the queen's windowless room, a satisfaction curdled into boredom. She asked the mirror still and heard the same answer, fairest, and discovered that a word you steal does not fill you the way a word you earn does. She began to go to the window she had no more often, pacing the perimeter of a room that did not exist, restless as smoke. Once she almost asked the mirror a different question. Am I loved? She did not. The glass, relieved, did not have to say what truth sounds like when it forgets to be gentle. One day, as summer considered lending its heat to early autumn, the prince said a request to the dwarfs that surprised even him with its shape. "Let me take her home," he said. "Not to keep her, not to lock her in a tower where I can pretend I solved anything, but to carry some of this with me so you can sleep. I will send for you. I will write. I will not be selfish with sorrow." He looked at their faces and saw the way trust and fear are twins wrestling. "And if you say no, I will understand, and I will go on sitting where I am allowed." The dwarf spoke long and low. They weighed the prince's voice against their knowledge of men with maps, his hands against their memory of hands that had pressed too hard. They remembered that he had asked to sit, asked to return, asked to build, asked to carry. He had not taken. The leader nodded, slow as a hinge that has been oiled on purpose. "You may," he said, "on one condition." "Name it," said the prince. "Carry her yourself," said the leader, "and carry her like you would carry the moment you learned you were forgiven." The prince bowed. "I will." They began at dawn, when air is soft and strong at once. The dwarfs walked ahead to show the steady places, and the prince and two of his men followed with the glass held up like a thought that cannot be risked knocking. The path turned and lifted and narrowed and widened. Birds escorted and scolded, escorting more than scolding as the morning wore on. At a root made slick by dew, one of the men slipped a little. No stumble, only the suggestion of a stumble, and the prince checked him so quickly the glass hardly quivered. But the motion jostled Snow White just enough, a breath's worth, a needle's width of shift. Something in her throat moved. It was nothing. It was everything. None of them noticed. Not yet. They carried on, with the dwarfs' rules keeping rhythm at their heels and hope refusing to be born too early. Chapter 15, A Kiss of Awakening. They reached the prince's garden as afternoon slid warm gold over stone. It was not a show garden. It had been built before his father loved parades and after his mother had loved simple peaches. The paths were honest. The trees had been planted for shade, not for boasting. The fountain spoke to itself in a corner where it would not interrupt conversation. He had asked that the little chapel stand near this quiet, a brother to the dwarf's chapel, not its rival. They set Snow White down where the light did the gentlest work, and the breeze could be counted on to remember manners. The prince dismissed his men with a word and the kind of smile that sends people away without feeling sent. He opened the door to the small, bright room and closed it again behind him so that the moment would not have to perform. He stood with his hand on the glass, but not touching it, as if to remind himself that even now there are lines you do not cross carelessly. He said her name. He had said it 100 times, 1,000. Today it sounded like something that could answer. Snow White. The word bled into silence and did not die there. He sat. He took a breath that was not a speech, not a declaration, not even a plan. It was an ordinary breath, the kind a person takes between one kindness and the next. He told her what had happened on the path, that small jolt, and laughed at himself for noticing such a small thing, as if the world might have shifted. "I am making mountains of grains of sand," he said, "because I have built a life out of believing that the next thing might be the thing that matters." He looked at her mouth. It was the same as yesterday, as last season, as the day beneath birch in the dwarf's clearing. And yet, a person in love is always a scientist and a poet. He looked for data and listened for music and found both, which is a dangerous thing to find at once. He had never thought kisses were spells. He had been kissed in court and on battlefields and in doorways and had believed each time only what the moment could bear. Now he believed something else, that a kiss can be a sentence with no command in it, only care. He bent and pressed his mouth to hers the way a person presses a seal to a letter he is sending away with his whole heart. No demand, only an offering of breath as if to say, "Here is mine if yours is too heavy to lift alone." The world did not shake. The glass did not crack. The fountain did not throw its water higher in applause. Something smaller happened, so small he might have missed it if he had been the kind of man who needed trumpets, a swallow that wasn't his. A tiny sound like a fruit releasing itself from a branch because it had found the right word for let go. A piece of apple, lodged where it had no right to be, shifted, lifted, slid. Snow White coughed. It was an unlovely sound. The first honest thing in days to care nothing about beauty. The prince flinched with joy like a horse at thunder, and then made himself still so the moment could be the bravest thing in the room. He lifted the glass with the careful hands. He slid an arm behind her shoulders the way the dwarfs had taught him. There is a right way to hold someone who forgot how to be held and must learn again. Her eyes opened into light that did not hurt. First, the world came back in edges, the bright rim of a window, a thread on the hem of his sleeve, the exact green of a leaf that had layered itself with 100 greens since she last saw one. Then the world came back in shapes, his face, not as she remembered it from stories, because she had no stories of him, but as a kindness pressed into bone. Then words returned, shy and useful. "Oh," she said, the most accurate sentence available. "I'm here," he said, which was not the right answer to "oh," and was also exactly the right answer. She sat, not quickly, not slowly, not the speed a person uses when she is listening to a body that has saved her and needs to be thanked with gentleness. Her hand found her braid and the ribbon at its end, the ribbon that had once held fear and had learned to tie the edges of day together instead. "What happened?" she asked. Because you must ask even when you know, so that the telling can put the last stone where it belongs. "An apple," he said, and did not make the word cruel. A small bite, a stubborn sleep, a long waiting. "And then a kiss," she said, blush rising, not as embarrassment, but as circulation, as if blood had decided to write poetry again. "And then a cough," he smiled, as if to say, the miracle was shaped like the body choosing itself. He helped her to the door. The air outside made a noise like surprise when it touched her skin and found it warm. The fountain went on speaking. Somewhere a gardener swore softly at a nettle. The world did not stop to witness and was, for exactly that reason, perfect. They sent word to the dwarfs. The runner tripped twice and got up the way a heart does. In the clearing, 7 men looked at one another and did not move for a breath because movement might tear the thin, shining film of what if that had draped itself over the day. Then they ran, and the forest had to widen its paths to let them pass without bruising themselves on hope. Oh, when they arrived, there were no speeches. The leader took Snow White's hands and turned them over as if checking the state of a tool he cherished. The anxious one cried in a way that shook laughter loose in everyone else. The quiet one stood behind her and looked at the garden, at the sky, at the prince, at his own shoes, and then placed his palm between her shoulders for a second, the way you steady a friend on a boat. "You're late for supper," said the cheerful one, and was not scolded for the joke. "Rules," the stubborn one began out of muscle memory and love, then stopped, grinned, and shook his head. "No rules right now." They walked together, no procession, no pomp, into the little chapel, then out of it again, because chapels are for silence, and this was a moment that needed the world's sounds. The prince did not ask for anything. He did not ask for her hand, her word, her gratitude, her future. He stood with his own hands empty and his heart unhidden, and that was the most persuasive speech he would ever make. Snow White looked at all of them, at the men who had kept her safe when air had not known how, at the prince whose kiss had been a good question rather than a demand, at the trees that had learned her name and set it back in leaves, and felt something unclenched that had been clenched since a room with no windows and a mirror that told the wrong person the right truth. "I would like to go home," she said. And no one asked her which home she meant, because they all answered at once, and all their answers were the same: yes. They went first to the dwarf's cottage. The clearing cheered, which looked like wind where there was no wind, and sounded like branches tapping the glass of a day that had decided to be better. Snow White set the kettle on, because this is how you end a miracle properly. The dwarf sat and did not sit, and sat again. The animals came to the threshold and pretended they were only passing through on errands. When the tea had been poured and the bread cut, and the butter softened and the chairs adjusted a dozen times so everyone felt correctly companioned, they began to speak of what came next. The prince waited until the talk had found its raft and was floating in the right direction before he offered his hand. Not to take, to steady. "Come with me," he said finally, when asking could be an honor and not a theft. "To a place where you can be safe and useful, and sung to when you are too tired to sing. Come as a guest, a queen-to-be, a friend. Choose the name for your place, and we will learn to say it correctly." Snow White looked at the 7 faces that had taught her the geometry of belonging. "I will come," she said, and the dwarfs nodded, because love is not possession. It is the joy of watching someone step toward their own weather. "But I will come back," she added. And the prince said, "Of course." And the dwarf said, "Of course." And the forest sighed the same promise in leaves. In the palace across the valley, the queen stood before her mirror and felt, for the first time, a draft in a room that had no door. "Fairest?" she asked, and heard nothing for a long time, because the mirror was listening to a girl breathe. When it spoke, it did not soften. "Snow White," it said, and truth, having waited patiently, arrived with the force of a dawn that had been delayed too long. The queen's smile broke at last, not into tears. Tears cannot live where envy lives, but into fear. Fear is a teacher that comes late and charges tuition few can afford. She turned from the glass and found that the room with no windows finally had one, opening onto a sky that would not come when called. But that is another chapter's weather. For now, a garden, a cottage, a little chapel made of careful wood, a prince who had learned the taste of waiting, 7 friends whose hands smelled of thyme and stone, and a girl standing between spring and summer with a ribbon in her hair and a home in more than one direction. The day folded itself gently. Someone laughed in the kitchen. Someone lit a candle because light looks good next to joy. Someone, perhaps the world, whispered, "You are safe. You are loved. You are home." And the words found exactly the person they were meant for. Chapter 16, the return to the castle. They did not rush. The road between the dwarf's clearing and the prince's city was the distance between 2 kinds of home, and Snow White asked to feel each step with her own feet. The dwarfs walked the first miles with them, tools left in a tidy stack by the cottage, door latched, hearth banked, as if the house itself were taking a nap and would wake to the sound of their laughter later. The animals escorted them to the edge of the old birches. The deer nosed Snow White's palm. The rabbits wrote soft exclamation points with their ears. The birds wove a braid of small songs overhead. "I'll be back," she promised. And the forest believed her because the forest knows the weight of true words. They reached the city when afternoon light had turned coins in shop windows into small suns. People looked up and then looked twice, as if they had glimpsed a story stepping out of a book and could not bear to close the cover. The prince raised a hand, not for silence, but for gentleness. "This is Snow White," he said simply. "Speak to her the way you'd speak to a friend who just came home." And the city learned at once that kindness sounds best when it is not shouted. In the palace kitchens, the head cook set down his ladle and forgot to pick it up. He had kept a tart cooling on the sill for months before grief used up that habit. He had never once taken a bite himself. Now he dusted flour from his hands onto his apron and wept into the onion basket, then laughed at himself and salted the soup, and pretended he had only ever planned to do both at once. At the great doors, the guards stood straighter but not stiffer. They had been trained to hold back crowds and trouble, and also, quietly, to make room for miracles. They swung the doors wide. The prince offered his arm, not because she needed help to walk, but because two people can carry joy more easily when they carry it together. Inside, the castle exhaled a chill it had been holding for years. Tapestries seemed to loosen on their hooks. The marble steps remembered that feet could make music instead of noise. Servants did the polite thing and lowered their eyes, then did the braver thing and lifted them again. They saw a young woman with a ribbon in her hair and steadiness in her shoulders. She saw them. The seamstress with pricked thumbs, the groom with hay in his sleeve, the maid who had never once carried her own softness the whole length of a corridor. "Hello?" Snow White said to each in turn, and the word landed like a key in a lock. "Before anything else," she told the steward, "open the windows." He hesitated. The palace had preferred heavy curtains, swallowed light, the hush of perfume air. "Yes, he began. "Snow White," she said, kindly solving his sentence. They went room by room. Curtains drew aside like sighs turned into silk. Dust motes threw themselves into sunbeams as if auditioning for a happier story. A page boy, eyes wide, was sent to fetch basins and soap for anyone who wished to wash the day from their hands before new work began. Someone laughed in a hallway and did not stop themselves. Someone whispered, "It feels like spring in here," and the building heard and agreed. No one announced the Queen's absence, but everyone felt it the way you feel when a storm turns back over the hills. She had shut herself in her windowless chamber when the mirror's truth returned to its truer shape, Snow White, and fear had been speaking to her ever since, fast and quiet and sharp. She rang no bells. She took no meal. She wore a path into the carpet that looked like a figure 8, like a knot that did not know how to become a bow. That evening, Snow White and the prince ate in the great hall with the doors open, so the night air could remember its way in. The dwarf sat at the prince's table, blinking in the candlelight, spoons in hand, time tucked in their cuffs, because old habits had packed themselves and come along. The head cook set down bowls of onion soup that had been simmering since Hope first returned to the kitchens and said, "Eat," in a tone that meant, "You are safe now." They did, and silence fell, not the old winter silence, but the happy hush people make when the thing in front of them asks for both hands and their whole attention. The prince watched the room the way a gardener watches rain. Snow White ate slowly, and not because she feared any bite, but because she wanted the taste of the safety to stay long in her mouth. Later, she walked alone to the chapel, the little one the prince had built near his garden, and sat in the doorway. The city had gone soft with evening. She folded her hands the way you fold a letter after reading it twice. "Thank you," she said to everything and to no one. Behind her, the mirror in the room with no windows waited. Truth is patient. Fear is not. The queen would not sleep. Neither would the night. Her story had arranged itself for morning. Chapter 17. The Queen's Downfall. Dawn put one careful finger on the palace and asked, "Is today the day?" The palace, feeling generous, said, "Yes," but softly. Snow White rose early, dressed simply, and braided her hair the way she'd learned in the cottage. Quick, neat, a ribbon at the end tied with a thought of home. The prince met her in the corridor, eyes bright and worried, as if happiness itself might be delicate. "Are you ready?" he asked. "I am," she said, and meant not only for morning. They walked to the small door at the back of the great hall, the one that leads to the little staircase that leads to the room with no windows. 2 guards waited there, gentler than guards often are, men who had been told to keep the peace, not to make a spectacle. Snow White lifted her hand. "Stay here," she said. "If shouting comes, let it fold itself smaller. I will call if I need strength that is not mine." The prince hesitated, then bowed his head. "I will be listening," he said, which is another kind of being near. The staircase remembered the queen's steps, fast when envy was hungry, slower when envy had fed. Today Snow White climbed it with a pace the stairs liked at once. She knocked the way she knocks everywhere, like a friend who can wait. The silence on the other side felt like a room holding its breath under a blanket. "Stepmother," Snow White said. And the word was not sugar, it was simply true. "May I come in?" The lock turned as if a hand had only just remembered how to lift it. The door opened a crack. One eye ringed in sleeplessness, one voice hoarse and thin as thread. "Go away." Snow White did not push. She did not plead. "I will stand here," she said, "and say what I came to say, and then I will go if you send me." She waited the length of a careful breath. "I forgave you," she said softly, and behind the door something flinched. "Not because you asked, and not because I am good, and forgiveness is a trick that makes me shinier. I forgave you because I needed to live whole. Carrying you inside me as a blade would have cut everything I tried to hold." The door opened wider, not because the queen's heart asked, but because curiosity still lived where love had not been allowed. Her face was beautiful the way a mask is. Her hands trembled the way a string trembles after you pluck it, and before it decides which note to be. "You mock me," she whispered. "No," Snow White said. "I free myself." She looked past the queen to the room. Curtains, vials, powders asleep in little silent bottles, a table, a chair, and the mirror. It had always seemed large. Today it looked only as big as a mistake. She stepped aside so her body was not between the queen and the doorway. "You can come down with me," she offered. "You can eat bread that was baked by a man who cried into his onion basket this morning. You can walk in the garden where the fountain talks to itself. You can sit at the edge of a kitchen and say you are sorry to the cook and the scullery boy and the groom and anyone else you remember stepping on when you were trying to climb to the wrong throne." The queen stared at her, then at the mirror. It shimmered not with magic, but with the ordinary unease of a thing that has been asked the same question too long. She went to it as drowned people go to water from habit. "Mirror," she said, and her voice still had the old steel, though rust had begun to write itself along the edges. "Who is the fairest of them all?" The glass did not ripple into a face. It did not speak at once. When it did, the voice sounded like a hand being washed clean. "You have asked the wrong question all your life," it said. "You do not need me to know what beauty is. You need someone you can trust to tell you when you are loved." The queen reeled back as if truth had been a physical thing pushed into her chest. "Answer me," she hissed. And the hiss had the sound of a woman who had never been taught another shape for power. "Snow White," said the mirror, and cracked. Not shattering, no theater, no glittering hail across the floor. A single crack from one corner to the other, a line like a held-back tear. The queen reached toward it, as if she could hold the world together by buying one more moment of the same old lie. Her hand pressed to the glass. The crack slid beneath her fingers like a snake refusing to be caught. Something let go inside her. Not her life. Bedtime stories don't need violent ends to be just. What let go was the only story she had ever told herself. It left her, and she had nothing to put in its place. She sank to the chair and looked smaller than Snow White had ever seen her. It is difficult to watch the person who frightened you become a person you pity. Snow White stepped closer. "You cannot stay," she said, and her voice was gentle and sure at once. "Not with your hands empty and your mouth still looking for the old words. But you do not have to vanish into the woods. There is a convent 2 valleys over, where women who have forgotten how to use their power sit with their hands in warm water until they remember. There are gardens to tend, bread to bake, windows to open. If you can learn to ask better questions, you may yet live a true life inside your days." The queen's eyes flashed, a last stubborn spark of the old winter. "And if I refuse?" "Then you will go," Snow White said, not loudly. "Not banished with trumpets and humiliation, not dragged through streets, not hurt. You will simply not be allowed to keep breaking what you do not know how to love." She nodded to the guards waiting at the bottom of the stairs. "We have made room for mercy here. We will also make room for the door to close." The queen looked from Snow White to the mirror, to the open doorway where a thin slice of morning waited like a handkerchief. Pride lifted its head once, a tired animal in a body that could not afford to feed it anymore. She stood. "I will go," she said. And the admission released something into the room that smelled like air after rain. She left without ceremony, no headlines, no curses, no promises to return draped in thunder. The guards walked at a distance that said, "We see you as a person, not a prize." The corridor sighed as she passed. The stairs carried her carefully, a courtesy they extend even to feet that have stomped on them. Snow White stood alone with the mirror. It reflected her face, then the room, then only light. She turned it to the wall. "Rest," she told it. "You have done enough speaking for one kingdom." Downstairs, the city was already learning how to celebrate without cruelty. The prince met her at the foot of the stair and read her face without asking questions that would exhaust her to answer. "Is it finished?" he asked. "It has begun," she said, which is the truer end. Chapter 18, A Wedding of Light. They decided quickly and slowly at once. Quickly, because joy loves a date to dress itself for. Slowly, because they wanted the celebration to feel like the life they meant to live. No sharp edges, nothing that glittered so loudly it made children cover their ears. Invitations went out in the mouths of birds and in the pockets of bread sellers, and in the apron folds of women who carried news the way other women carry milk. Come, wear what you can dance in. Bring the person you forgive most easily. Leave your mirrors at home. If you have a song, brush it and bring it on a string. The dwarfs arrived 2 nights early, each carrying something that didn't look like a gift until you saw it was. The leader brought a small, straight staff of birch. "For the walk to the altar," he said, "so the ground knows how serious we are." The steady one brought a mended cloth. "For the table," he said, "so spills have somewhere to go besides hearts." The anxious one brought a bundle of spare candles, then apologetically produced a second bundle, in case the first bundle forgets itself. The quiet one brought a stone polished so smooth your thumb could anchor your thoughts on it. The cheerful one brought a joke he had been saving for a day that could afford it. The thoughtful one brought a ledger he'd ruled with neat lines for writing down who had been thanked and who still needed a letter. The stubborn one brought a list of things that must be eaten while still hot. Snow White laughed and placed each gift where it would do the most good. "Stay near me," she told them, and they did, moving through the palace like a reminder. Home is a behavior, not a building. On the morning of the wedding, the city woke to the smell of cinnamon thrown into fires. Flags appeared, not the grand banners of conquest, but small strings of cloth stitched by many hands and hung from window to window like bridges. The head cook set tables not in the great hall, but in the courtyard so that strangers could sit beside nobles and learn, without anyone having to say it, that kindness outranks titles when you are holding a spoon. Snow White, dressed in a gown the color of cream, poured into sunlight. No heavy jewels, just a sprig of rosemary in her hair. "For remembrance," the steady dwarf said, tucking it there with hands that had mended much, and the ribbon she had worn when she tied fear into a bow in the woods. The prince wore what he wore when he asked people to trust him. Clothes he could work in, boots that had already learned how to step carefully in gardens. Around his shoulders, a short cloak like a morning cloud, because it made children smile. They did not walk down an aisle. They walked through their people, who made a lane with their bodies and their joy and their breath. The children reached. Snow White reached back. The old men stood. The prince touched their shoulders. The dwarfs came behind, faces wet and grinning, the stubborn one failing to pretend he wasn't crying, the cheerful one failing to pretend he wasn't too. At the front, there was no stage, only a little circle of birch staves driven into the grass and bound with ribbons, the same birch from the dwarf's clearing, the same color as the staff the leader had brought. They stepped into that ring, and the whole world seemed to step with them. "Speak," said the woman asked to witness, an abbess from the valley where the queen would learn to keep her hands busy. She had eyes like bread rising and a voice people would have trusted to call rain. "Say what you intend." The prince went first. "I will stand where you can see me," he said, "and I will not hide behind duties when you need a person more than a title. I will not ask the mirror for answers love can give." Snow White smiled, because sometimes vows are startling, and because startling can be the truest way to be brave. "I will keep windows open," she said. "I will stay teachable. I will not let the palace forget the recipe for onion soup. I will return to the cottage until its broom misses me less." She reached for his hand. "I will ask better questions." They tied their hands together with the ribbon she'd worn in the forest. The abbess nodded. "This is enough," she said, and the city clapped the way bread claps the sides of a pan when it is ready to be turned out. Music began, not all at once, but the way rain begins in a friendly storm. Here a fiddle, there a pipe, a drum answering from the corner, then voices finding their way into a song they had always known. The dwarfs danced with the laundresses and the lamplighters. The prince's father danced with a woman who sold eggs and learned how to laugh without feeling watched. Snow White danced with anyone who offered a hand, and sometimes with no one, when the song asked her to turn the way a leaf turns in wind. At the feast, there was a pie for every kind of hunger. Meat pies that needed both hands, apple pies with crusts dusted like first frost, berry pies that stained smiles purple. There were stews that told the truth about onions and patience, loaves that had risen without drama and arrived exactly when needed, cheeses that remembered grass and rain, There was lemonade in tubs for children and older men who disliked wine, and there was wine for women who had earned a day too sweet to carry sober. Plates were passed hand to hand, slower than necessary and exactly as slow as love likes to travel. No one missed the Queen. They spoke of her only once, a murmur of, "May she learn what we learned." And then the conversation returned to the table. Who needs salt? Who needs a seat? Who needs to be pulled into the circle so they can remember they have always belonged in it? As the sun leaned west, lanterns bloomed. They were not the grand crystal necklaces the palace had owned. They were simple glass jars with floating candles, 1,000 small moons strung through the courtyards and gardens. The fountain cleared its throat and tried a louder voice. Children threw petals into its basin and named the ripples after their favorite dwarfs. At the end, when feet were tender and songs had loosened every tight place sorrow had tried to keep, Snow White stood on a bench so she could look over everyone's head at once and said, "Thank you." It was not a queen's speech. It was a woman in a room full of people she loved. "If you ever feel afraid," she said, "come to the kitchens. There will be soup." The city answered the way cities answer when they are ready to be better. With laughter, with tears, with a promise that lives without needing to be written. Chapter 19, Happily Ever After. Happily Ever After turned out not to be a door you walk through and then forget. It was work, daily, holy, ordinary work. The kind you do with sleeves rolled and a song under your breath. Snow White and the Prince built their days the way gardeners build a season, with early mornings, with weather watching, with patience for growth that prefers to arrive quietly. They opened the palace once a week, the big doors, the side doors, the kitchen doors, and anyone could come eat if anyone needed to. The head cook instituted soup court. Bring a complaint, receive a bowl, and while you eat, someone will sit beside you and listen, and afterward, help you carry whatever can be carried. Arguments got shorter in a city where hunger had fewer places to hide. Snow White often sat in the laundry, not to supervise, but to share the water and the gossip, and because washing is laughter's favorite room. She learned how to mend a torn cuff blindfolded, the steady dwarf's lesson, how to remove pitch with butter, the cheerful one's trick, and how to keep your hands gentle even when the stain makes you angry, the quiet one's reminder. The laundresses stopped curtsying after a week. They started saving her the best stories. On market days, the prince bought bread from the new baker who had once been the scullery boy, and he always overpaid, and the boy always pretended not to see and always slipped extra into the bag of the nearest child. The prince walked home by the long way on purpose, past the school where children sometimes wrote their letters on the paving stones with chalk, past the herb woman who taught anyone who asked which leaf belonged on what wound, past the old man who had decided to get better at whistling in his 70th year. It changed him to be known like this, in pieces, without a trumpet. They did not put the mirror back on its stand. At Snow White's request, they carried it to the archives and faced it toward a window so it could spend a season reflecting only dawn. Once a month, the abbess came from the valley. She would stand with Snow White and the prince and stare at the pale plane of it, as if staring could teach glass to rest. "It may one day be used to show the seamstress a hem from far away," the abbess said, eyes kindly. "It must never again be asked to rank souls." The queen's name faded gradually from voices and gradually from anger. News came on a cart. She had taken to kneading bread before first bell, to tending a small patch of beans, to opening windows in the convent that had forgotten how. She had not become sweetness, but the mirror in her head had cracked too. She did not ask it for the old answer anymore. "That is enough," Snow White told the prince when the letter arrived. Sometimes enough is the best wish comes true. The dwarfs came and went with seasons, each visit announced by the scent of thyme in the great hall and the sudden appearance of 7 small tools leaning in a tidy row by the kitchen door. They never knocked. They stood at the threshold until someone saw them and shouted, and they were folded into arms and fed until they begged mercy. They taught palace stonemasons their songs, so the tunnels under the city would stay friendly, and palace scribes their ledger tricks, so the counting would be honest. They always left with pockets full of bread crusts, because Snow White insisted crusts are a love letter to the part of you that needs steadying. Sometimes, when the day gave them a long afternoon without interruptions and the weather closed its mouth to listen, Snow White and the prince rode out to the clearing. The cottage greeted them as if it had been waiting with its best cup in hand. Snow White swept. "You've been fine without me," she'd scold the floor. "But let me do this." And the prince stacked wood, and the animals returned to practice their old habit of pretending not to stare. They talked in the doorway until the blue hour, the time the dwarfs had always liked best, when the sky remembers both day and night at once. They had children later, but the story does not hurry to their names. It is enough to say the palace learned to live at a volume that did not make little ears flinch. The nursery windows were kept open. Cries were answered by whoever was closest. Lullabies borrowed melodies from mine songs and washing songs and table songs, and no one minded the mixture. A life is exactly that. When the prince fell ill for a week one winter, nothing dangerous, only the kind of fever that makes a person feel too small for their body, Snow White read to him from the book of things worth knowing that require no mirror. The chapters were short and sensible. How to tie a knot so it can be untied. How to apologize without making the apology about yourself. How to keep soup from catching. How to ask for help while looking the person in the eyes so they can see you mean it. He recovered feeling safer than he had as a child. Years folded. The city grew softer around its bones. Occasionally, a voyager would come through with a grand tale of a nation where rulers dressed in armor to dinner and never smiled. The city would listen politely, feed the voyager, and send them on with a loaf and the suggestion to try soup court at home. Happily ever after was not perfect. Some days were cross, some were dull, some were chipped. But every evening, someone lit a candle, someone laughed in the kitchen, someone opened a window, and someone whispered to someone else, "You are safe. You are loved. You are home." The words never wore out. Chapter 20 at time farewell. Night returns every day, and every day the world remembers how to welcome it. The palace windows glowed like quiet stars. The city breathed. The garden fountain told its small story to the roses. In the little chapel, the candle under the simple glass sconce burned the way a heart burns when it has learned that beating is both a miracle and a job. Snow White walked the halls in slippers, the soft kind that tell floors secrets. She paused in the laundry to fold 2 towels that had been left without their pair, because wholeness likes to be invited. She looked into the kitchen where the head cook sat with his feet up for once, onion basket empty, eyes closed. She smiled and did not wake him. She checked the child's blanket, the small weight of sleep rising and falling the way waves do on a good beach. She stepped out onto the balcony and let the night lay its cool hand on her cheek. Behind her, the prince came and leaned his shoulder against the doorframe, the way people who love you learn to do, not crowding, not disappearing. "Tell me a story," he said, half yawn, half prayer. She did. Voice low, words slow, the way a river tells itself. She told the story of a girl whose mother taught her that windows open to snow make good wishes, of a huntsman who remembered his own softness just in time, of a forest that hides the hearts it is asked to keep, of 7 friends who turned care into a house, of a prince who learned that a kiss is not a command, of a queen who asked a better question, too late and not too late, of a city that discovered soup could be justice, of a mirror that got to spend its days reflecting only light. He listened with his eyes closed because listening with your eyes closed makes the world call your name more clearly. When she finished, he said, "Again," and she laughed. "Tomorrow," she promised. "We will tell it again tomorrow." Below in the courtyard, a guard shifted his weight and looked up and felt for a second, as if someone had put a blanket around his shoulders. In the gatehouse, a sleepy page traced the shape of a letter on the wood grain and remembered he would learn it in the morning. In the kitchen, the head cook woke just enough to pull a cloth over the bowl of dough so it would rise without catching cold. Snow White stepped back inside. She rounded a corner and found, as she always did, some small thing that asked for a hand, a ribbon fallen from a hook, a book a child had left open to a favorite picture, a sprig of rosemary that had gone dry. She tended each with the tenderness she had given to the combs and the laces, and the apples and the rules and the people. She had learned the art of small fixes, which, multiplied, is the science of keeping a life. She and the prince lay down. The candle hummed once and surrendered to the dark. Through the window, the sky drifted its stars closer, as if lending them for the night. In the far hills, the convent windows, once shuttered, stood open. A woman with bread on her hand smelled yeast and not jealousy, and let the scent teach her the next right thing. In the deeper forest, the cottage dreamed of brooms and thyme and tea, and the dwarfs slept with their tools within arm's reach, an old comfort they no longer needed and still loved to keep. And here, in this room, the story slowed its steps. It put a finger to its lips. It drew the blankets up to your chin. Listen. The night will hold you. Feel. The pillow will remember your shape. Breathe. The world is still here when your eyes are closed. If a worry knocks, let the door stay shut. If a mirror asks you a question, teach it a kinder one. If you find yourself in a forest, follow the song that sounds most like home. If you pass a kitchen, ask for soup. You are safe. You are loved. You are home. Sleep now, little dreamer. The lanterns are watching. The leaves are whispering secrets that can wait for morning. The story will be here when you wake.